Next panel is the East San Joaquin Water Quality Coalition.
Good morning, Chair Marcus, members of the board. We will keep our clock over here as we can see the clock. My name is Perry Clausen. I'm the Executive Director of the East San Joaquin Coalition, and I'd like to introduce my panel today. We have on my left Tess Dunham, who is the legal counsel for the coalition, and she and I will be going through the slides. We also have with us today Patrick Brown, University of California, Davis, who has been working with us on the end removed work with the Technical Advisory Work Group, as well as Michael Johnson. He's our Technical Advisor for our Surface and Groundwater Program. So they are going to be available for questions. And before I go on, I'd like to state that we are a real party of interest, but we did not petition this order. So what I wanted to give you as an overview of the presentation today, real quickly, of the East San Joaquin Coalition region, our member demographics, but also talk to you about the implementation efforts that we've been doing in surface water. We're also 3 years into collecting farm evaluation information and in our first year of nitrogen reporting, and also the education and outreach activities that we have done. And we're also going to give you some insight or some thoughts about our cost and policy implications for the new draft order. And really, we want to describe the progress that we've made since adoption of the order in 2003, and really the potential impact that we think this order may have on our coalition. We've been in place since 2003, since the Irrigated Lands Program was adopted. You see the statistics here on the slide in front of you. And we also would like to point out that we are generally a small-ish grower, average size of 200 acres, roughly 200 acres. And based on the request of our members, we have 17% of our members that are reporting electronically, and 83% of our members that report all of the documents in writing in paper form. So here's the map. You've seen that several times in our previous presentation. So I want to talk about the surface water program, because we started out with the program in 2004, designating waterways that we would be monitoring. In 2006, we had up to 25 monitoring sites that we've been sampling in the interim period of time. And one thing that we have focused on that we have control of primarily is the pesticide exceedances. Field parameters and such, it's a little more difficult to control those bacteria as well, but we have had a pretty dramatic drop in our pesticide exceedances in the time that you see here from 2008 to 2014, a direct result of the outreach and the contacts with growers that we have been doing in that period of time. Also, water column toxicity and sediment toxicity have dropped dramatically. And I'll give you a little bit of detail on that. One thing you need to keep in mind, and this isn't just for East San Joaquin, we're collecting an enormous amount of sample, 80,000 samples we've collected since our program began water monitoring and surface water monitoring in 2004. And I would estimate, back of the envelope, we've probably spent $10 million in that period of time. Our current budget is $3 million, and I'm a little low on that estimate. But to give you perspective, of those 80,000 samples, you look at this bar graph on the vertical axis. Of those 2008 samples, 3,460, 2014, 1,893, we have 1.2% of our samples that are showing pesticide exceedances. They're a little bit higher in applied metals, primarily copper, but still the point is that we are not seeing overwhelming water quality issues, but we are definitely focusing on the water quality issues that we've identified and have the potential impact on through farming practices. So as was explained earlier, when we have 2 or more detections in a waterway, it kicks in the management plan requirements. We submit a plan to the regional board of how we intend to address those issues. The water quality sampling that you see on the top is how we determine those, where those problems are. Then we, especially with pesticides, or particularly with pesticides, we'll go back to the county pesticide use reports and try to understand who has used the particular pesticides in those waterways. Then we identify the growers that are our members that are adjacent to these waterways, and then contact them individually, either first by letter, then by phone, to hold individual meetings with them. Myself and my staff have visited hundreds of growers since 2007 to talk about management practices that they should consider in their farming practice, in their farming operations. Then we continue monitoring, and as we have shown and we heard earlier, we've been able to finish and complete 78 separate management plans. And those management plans aren't just completed because we don't have exceedances anymore. We have conditions for them to be approved. There has to be 3 years of no exceedances of that constituent. We have to demonstrate implementation of the effective practices, and that information comes from our grower visits. We collect the practices that are using. We track, then go back to them, see what practices have you changed in subsequent years. And then once we present that evidence to the executive officer, they have to approve our petition to remove these management plans. And then, of course, we do continue surface water monitoring. So I want to talk, and you can see this is a similar graph. You saw earlier the completed management plans. 2012 was 3 years after we started our intensive outreach, and we continue to petition to remove these management plans from our requirements. So I want to talk about farm evaluation nitrogen reporting because those are relatively new requirements. Because our order was adopted first, lucky us, we got to do the farm evaluation outreach first to our members as well as the nitrogen reporting. So with the farm evaluations, they're a requirement of all members. There is some schedule and frequency depending on specific factors such as acreage. We have collected, or just in the most recent year, 923,000 records in 1 year of farm evaluation reports to our members, just to give you an idea. So we've done 3 years of that you can do the math to see. There's hundreds of thousands of records that we're collecting. And then we submit the information compiled on a township level to the regional board. And the responses that we get are for a number of things. For BMP implementation tracking, there is a question on the farm evaluation that asks if you discharge sediment. That triggers a sediment erosion control plan requirement. And then we're also using that information in member outreach, annual meeting member reports, and grower meetings. So just to run you through an example here, just give you an idea. Here's about 850 acre grower. I know it's a little bit hard to see, but this is his farm. So he would have this map in front of him as he completes the survey that you see on the right. He checks the practices and such that he's doing. We then take that information, we enter it by hand because most of these plans come in hard copies. We enter it into a relational database, which we then compile and store and create maps or create information that is useful for us, both for the individual farm, but for our township analysis. So you can just see this one farmer had 2 management units. He had grapes and almonds, so we compiled the information into management units. But he still had 336 individual records in a database every year that we tracked based on the information that he provided us. So the information that we collect, which is the first time this has ever been done in agriculture to an accurate sense, of course driven by the Irrigated Lands Program, is you see this information here. We have a very good idea of what growers are doing, what kind of practices they are implementing, where we focus outreach and such. Nitrogen we're beginning to do this as well. This is going to be very important in directing our outreach going forward to growers. So I want to segue into the nitrogen management because we are going to use the pattern that we've developed for surface water and apply it and use it as we go forward with nitrogen management. So we developed a template. Many of you have seen that before after our order was adopted in 2013. We took a little bit of time to develop the template because we knew that once a template was made, it was going to have to be used broadly throughout the Central Valley. All of the coalitions worked together. So we got the worksheet approved in December 14. January 15, it was sent to members for last year's crop planning. And then this past March, we had the first deadline for them to report back to us the nitrogen they applied in last year's crop. So this is the template. I'm not going to dwell on it. It's pretty complicated to go over in a presentation, but the point being is we tried to make it as simple as we could in one page to encompass the important information that we needed to provide to the water board and for them to use with planning. This is a document, a worksheet that stays on their farm. Then the next step was developing the summary report that growers would compile certain information from the worksheet and submit to us. So we had a template approved last November, November 15. We got it to our growers earlier this year in February, and we are in the process of analyzing the data that we received from those growers. And this, you can see here again, is the nitrogen management plan summary report. We developed instructions, detailed instructions for growers how to complete this. And the primary components that we are asking growers to report is, of course, the crop, the acreage, nitrogen applied, and then the AY ratio. We spent a year trying to determine, because we had the AR as nitrogen removed as our mandate, how are we going to get that information when we don't know what nitrogen removed is? So we came up with a recommendation to the regional board, which they accepted, to report A over Y, the applied nitrogen over their yield. Every grower knows what they apply, and they know what their yield is. So those numbers give us the ability to convert, and the coalition is doing this, convert that A over Y to, as you see in the bullets, the N applied to get the yield, and convert the yield to pounds, and then multiply the yield times the N removed converter, which CDFA has guidance values for, to obtain the amount of pounds of N removed. Then we divide the N applied per acre by N removed to get the AR ratio. So we just didn't feel, and we're supported by many agronomists and UC Extension, that this was too much to hand to growers to do this math at this point, especially since the removed component is so difficult to determine on many crops. So then here's the box and whisker plot that you saw earlier. The plan is, and this is just made up numbers, but many of the growers are going to land in the middle, likely land in the middle, and there's going to be outliers. You see 18 and 19 there, or grower number 18 and 19. So what we are planning to do is to send back the grower to the growers, to all the growers, that's sort of a box plot. Just find out where do you land in comparison to your neighbors in that township. And then we would be providing them some baseline for ours information. Pamela talked about it earlier, about the industry, fertilizer industry developed some excellent information on A over R. So then we plot those A over Rs to growers in a geographic region, and then we provide them information on crop specific N management. That's year one. The outliers, that's year one to the average. Year one of the outliers is we're going to send them information to indicate that you are outside of the norm of your township. Year two, we're going to direct outreach to individuals through member meetings, and possibly go to the one-on-one meetings and review the farm evaluation responses and try to understand, why are you above the average, the A over R. Then in year three, we may have some consultation with the regional board if they refuse, or if there just doesn't seem to be any movement on that person's activities. So I'm going to turn the microphone over to Tess Dunham. She's going to talk a little bit about outreach and then some of the policy implications.
Guess I have to push the button. Thanks, Perry. Yeah, so just real quickly to give you an idea of how extensive our member education and outreach activities are, and this is in addition to the individual member contacts that Perry described with respect to the follow-up on the surface water monitoring program. So that is totally separate. That is our, trying to deal with individuals that need direct help, attention, and information, but we also do our annual member meetings and provide updates with respect to any changes to the WDRs, timelines, requirements, go over extensively how they fill out the farm evaluation forms, go over extensively how they fill out the nitrogen management plan, go over extensively how they then fill out the summary reports. Just to give you an idea of, the numbers that we've done just in the last 3 years. In 2014, we had almost 3,000 attendees at 15 separate meetings throughout our coalition area. 2015, again, similar number with 15 meetings. And then 2016, which we've just started, we've already reached 2,000 attendees at 6 meetings. Clearly, we're not done, and we continue to have these meetings. And basically, we set them up on a area basis of three area-based ones, 3 or 4 times a year. So we are, continually rotating and meeting with folks, just to give you some ideas of the extensive actions there. I am going to then switch over to cost implications, and then I'm going to jump a little bit into some of the policy implications and current concerns that we have with the proposed revisions, as well as some recommendations that we would put forward. First on the cost, and this is just the coalition cost. I think it's really important to understand that, this isn't cost that growers will bear directly with respect to if they have increased cost for having a CCA certify their plan. This isn't any increased cost for fees going up to pay for the 99 PYs that the regional board may otherwise need. These are just the East San Joaquin coalition costs, which of course are passed on to the growers. Right now our big cost items are the surface water monitoring program, implementation of the farm evaluation requirements. We are now, of course, implementing the NMP requirements based upon the vulnerability distinctions that currently exist. That now applies to about 1,200 of our 4,000 growers. So to the extent that the vulnerability distinctions go away, and the nitrogen management plan summary requirements then apply to everybody reporting to us. We anticipate, obviously, those costs go basically multiplying by 4 because of the number of the people. And so we'll give you here an estimate, based upon our estimates, and this is taking into account how much, and they went back and actually looked how much time staff have, like 3 or 4 staff people handling just phones of people calling, asking for assistance and having to fill out this information. We think that the new order would increase just our coalition budget by about almost 20%. So our annual budget would, and this is probably pretty conservative and on the low end, but for our current 2016 budget is about $3.1 million. We see it increasing upwards towards $4 million, which would increase our per cost to grower. Our current fee that we charge just for the coalition is $3.75 per acre. We see this going up to $5 an acre. And again, this does not include the additional fee that is assessed for the waste discharge requirements program through the State Water Board's fees program. So, at the current level, that's what, 75 cents. So you're talking $6. And of course, clearly the increase in resources needed at the regional board would take that 75 cents upwards to who knows how much, and doesn't include cost to the growers directly out of pocket. So we do see it as a significant cost increase. Now switching over to some of the policy implications that I wanted to touch on, and we're not going to touch on all of them, but we will in our written comments. But for today's purposes, wanted to touch very briefly on some of the major ones. And the first 2 that I have up here are much broader policy implications, and my concern and our concern with the draft order is it continues to try to, I think, maintain the elephant in the room that we think that agriculture can meet all water quality objectives in some, artificial timeline, whether it's 5 years or 10 years. And I think that, we've had some pretty honest conversations with people, that especially when it comes to salinity and nitrates, that is probably not true. It may be true on a limited occasion for some crops in some areas, but when you're dealing with salinity and nitrates with respect to groundwater and in an agricultural system, it's highly unlikely that most of agriculture is going to be able to prove or demonstrate that they can meet a water quality objective of, say, 10 milligrams per liter below the root zone. I think that's we've been pretty honest about that. And in fact, that is the whole purpose of the CV Salts program, is to talk about how do we do salt and nitrate management planning on a valley, basin-wide basis or a sub-basin, and of course, recognizing that there may be need for alternative compliance pathways with respect to either having much more extensive longer time periods for reaching compliance with water quality objectives in the groundwater, or for potentially having exceptions if necessary. And I was a little disappointed that the draft order doesn't really recognize any of that. It doesn't recognize the efforts of CV Salts. It doesn't recognize the potential need for alternative compliance pathways, and instead continues to, I think, perpetuate the fallacy that we're going to be able to show for all constituents that we can meet water quality objectives in a specified time period. And I also, in particular, it talks about the non-point source policy pretty extensively, and continues to maintain a point in the non-point source policy, which frankly has gotten us all in trouble with the courts, is the non-point source policy basically says the regional board must determine that there is a high likelihood the implementation program will attain stated water quality objectives. With salinity and nitrates, I don't know how we do that in all areas of the Central Valley, to be honest. And instead of recognizing some of the problems that we have with the non-point source policy that was developed at a different time before we had the information we have now, I think that my concern is the draft order continues to maintain this image that we can do that. And I just think it's important that we're honest. That, like stormwater, as you did in the LAMS4 permit, you were very honest about the fact that, you know, there may be extensive timeframes necessary to meet receiving water limits because of stormwater. Agriculture is not that different, and I think we need to be honest about that here in this order, or we continue to set all of ourselves up for failure. Not to say that we shouldn't be doing the best that we can. We absolutely should. We should continue to evaluate what are the most effective practices and make the improvements that we can, as we've been able to show in the surface water program, which is frankly much easier. But I just think we have to be honest with the reality. And so those are kind of my first big policy, comments I wanted to make. Specific to the changes in the order, the other things I want to talk about is really this eliminating the vulnerability, and from our perspective, how that causes us concern from an administrative burden standpoint, and why we think it takes away our coalition flexibility for prioritizing on the areas that we think are the most important. I also do want to talk about the fact that it does report and mandate the public reporting of the field level information. I'm sure you won't be surprised to note that I have a different viewpoint than Pamela or Ms. Creedon did with respect to this issue as it came up in her presentation. And then also want to talk a little bit about the domestic well sampling and how we think it is an important public health issue, but we think this is not the proper program and it should be addressed in a different manner. So first on the vulnerability, the changes in the order switches everything from making priority based on where we think the vulnerable or high priority areas are, however you want to make it determined, to based upon size of the operation. In our mind, and based upon our evaluation, and different coalitions may look at it differently, this greatly increases the administrative burden that we have, because instead of now being able to focus in certain geographical areas that are the areas of major concern, we now have scatter shots, and I have some examples of maps to be able to show you. We have scatter shots of where we're trying to get which size growers in to do which summary reports when, and frankly, I'm not so sure it helps environmentally to do it on a scatter shot operational size versus looking at other ways to prioritize reporting or phasing requirements. We would request that the order be revised to allow us the flexibility to phase in reporting requirements based upon a priority scheme that we think is appropriate, taking into account consideration of the actual quality of the groundwater, which is what we're all highly concerned with, and also looking at the quality of the groundwater in comparison as it is to disadvantaged communities and disadvantaged unincorporated communities. And we'll show you some maps. This is what it looks like if you try to do something by size of the operation. Purple are those growers with less than 60 acres, green are 60 to 250, and then the orange are over 250. So in other words, we're phasing in timing all over our coalition region. Versus, if you go to the next slide, this is how it looks if we based it on what our current high vulnerability designations are, and in comparison, looking at the high vulnerability areas to the green is the disadvantaged communities, the purple is the disadvantaged unincorporated areas or communities. You will see our areas where we are focusing our efforts right now very well coincide with, to us, the areas of highest concern, and that is these disadvantaged communities that may have groundwater wells that are exceeding standards. So we think it makes far more sense to have the nitrogen management summary reporting requirements that are being in place based upon priority area versus size of the operation. We just think it is far more appropriate, protects groundwater in the areas of greatest concern first. So that is a change that we would request, is to be either to go back to the vulnerability, which you may or may not be willing to do, but at least allow flexibility in prioritizing how reporting timelines should evolve. talking about then the public reporting of the field level information, and we don't believe it is necessary to require that the information be made available publicly, and for a couple of reasons. And first, let me state that I disagree with Ms. Creedon that we are a private nonprofit, and we do receive data and information from individuals. Unless that information, the information that we hold, unless we actually give it to the regional board and it goes to the regional board's files, we do not consider it public information. If, I think Ms. Creedon suggested that it's public because it's been collected for the program, even though it's held by a private nonprofit, we disagree with that legally, and for many other reasons. I think also the practical reality is while the regional board may not be concerned about privacy concerns, I guarantee you our coalition board is. The coalitions were created in large part to help incentivize and get people involved in surface and groundwater programs. And a big part of that was allowing the coalitions to work directly with the growers. If there is no, and it's not a shield, because we do things vigorously, rigorously, and there's a lot of communication. If we have members that are not, participating in good faith in the coalition, then they are no longer basically members, and the regional board knows that. So it's not a shield. But it does provide an incentive for growers to participate in a coalition and get the information that they need, and for us to be able to determine the management practices that they're implementing and the changes that they need to make. If it's public reporting, and in particular of the nitrate reporting summary information, you take away that incentive for people to be in a coalition. And frankly, at that point in time, the purpose of the coalition, it becomes very questionable. Are people really going to want to pay $5 an acre to belong to a coalition when there's no advantage, and all it does, it's an individual report, they're a pass-through of individual information to the regional board, and in fact puts burdens on the coalition to summarize, analyze the individual data in a manner that doesn't currently exist, although we do plenty of other types of evaluation, and the cost and increase. So I think that there is great concern with that from a practical standpoint and the impact of what it does to the coalitions. And people will ask, I've had, some folks ask me, would our coalition go away if the order was adopted today as it is currently proposed? And honestly, the answer is, I don't know. Our board would probably have to think very long and hard whether they want to take on that liability and that burden in order to gather all this information and make it publicly available to the state. But we do think that we recognize that accountability is absolutely important for the efficacy of all of these programs. And the regional board already has the absolute ability to request individual data if they think that there's a member that's a problem. They have the ability to go out and are inspecting grower operations. Right now, we know that they are in our coalition area. We also, they can come in and inspect our coalition records at our offices anytime that they want. So they are the regulatory entity. They have the ability to do that. We would suggest that there is a way to, while we believe that authority already exists, if it's necessary to call out in the draft order or revisions to require a certain amount of auditing of percentage of grower operations on an annual basis, or that the regional board has to audit the coalition records at least annually, we have no problem with that and would be fine with that type of recommendation to provide the certainty and the accountability that you all need, but at the same time providing privacy protection for the individual growers in order to maintain the incentive of being in a coalition. And as you can see, we honed in on the surface water successes to show you what we can do as a coalition, and I think we can be far more effective with the groundwater program based upon our past success by remaining as a coalition in the way that we are versus just becoming a pass-through of information that people have a lot of concern with sharing. Oh, Perry says I have 1 minute. That's good because it's my last issue. So the last issue I want to bring forward is the domestic well monitoring issue. We get absolutely public health is a huge concern, and domestic wells, knowing what the quality of water is through, those that rely on domestic wells is a public health issue that should be addressed. But we also think it's a state, Division of Drinking Water or a local county government issue. We are concerned that what it does is it's bringing this statewide issue into the irrigated lands program, and frankly, you're only going to reach a small percentage of domestic wells through the irrigated lands program, right? You still have how many remaining domestic wells out there that are totally uninvolved in the irrigated lands program that aren't going to be tested and notification isn't going to be provided. And frankly, the way it's currently set up in the draft order, if you can give me another minute, I can finish. The way it's set up in the draft order, you require the coalition to gather all of the domestic sample results to give them to the regional board. That is a huge burden. And frankly, if the board decides to maintain that requirement as is, we would actually ask that take the coalition out of it, at least from our perspective, make it a direct reporting between the grower and the regional board. I think the regional board already expressed their concern with the resources it imposes on them, but I guarantee you the coalition has a very similar feeling with respect to it. And for those of you that may or may not know, Perry and I have been involved with the Central Coast Groundwater Coalition program, implementing this program, and we know how big of an effort that this is. And as has been explained, the Central Valley is how many times larger than the Central Coast. So those, would be our concern. And, I personally, I think that the law needs to be changed to require and mandate that all domestic wells be monitored, or at least county ordinances be revised to do so. And, to the extent it has to do with the landlord-tenant issues, there are other forums and places for this type of requirement to be far more effective than bringing it into an irrigated lands program, which is about addressing, irrigated lands and discharges to groundwater and surface water. So with that, I think that's everything. And these are Perry's peaches, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
Did your cost estimates include the drinking water requirements on testing?
No. No, I think we, back of the envelope, it's, probably a couple $100 per well, and then you got the lab and the hassle, but we didn't even try to figure out what the cost would be to the coalition to then try to track down, make sure the growers have done the testing, get their results, take all the results and PDF them or whatever, upload them to GeoTracker or whatever's supposed to happen with them to get them to the regional board, follow up, make sure notification. We didn't even cost out what that cost would be on the coalition.
I think
We have 4,000. We have 4,000 members. We estimate 2 wells each. That's 8,000 wells. We sampled about 700 wells on the Central Coast. So it's an enormous undertaking just in our coalition, much less the whole Central Valley.
I think it'd be helpful to have that information if you could provide it maybe, by the next workshop.
Written copy.
And then just a point of maybe not disagreement, but just different approach. Ms. Dunham, you're saying that on the incentive to being in a coalition, that the proposed order removes that incentive and the whole purpose of the coalition. I think there are a lot of other very valuable components of the coalitions, education, outreach, all that you've been talking about, but not to put words in your mouth, but I think what you're talking about is from the grower's perspective, the main advantage would be gone.
I think that's true. Yeah, I mean, the main advantage is data gets aggregated in a manner that provides accountability, gives the water boards the information that they're looking for. I mean, I think you could see by some of the slides that Perry had, we are supplying an enormous amount of data and information. Under the current program, you will multiply that by tenfold by then adding two things, by taking away the vulnerability determination, which means just in our coalition you go from 1,200 to 4,000 with nitrate summary reports, and then whatever that number is across the valley increases that number of reporting, and the nitrogen summary report aggregates information on a township, and you're going to have it at a field level, and I don't know what that then ends up looking like as far as data, but it's enormous.
And then the last question has to do with, thanks for the specific information on what you do with these reports. But hasn't the program evolved? A lot of what you're talking about, especially on the treatment of outliers, is not in the current order.
Yes, it
It's
is.
some- it is.
It is in the
On
current
year
order.
type.
That's why we started to do this collection of data. It's a requirement to do the summary reports. We are now analyzing the data as we speak, Michael Johnson's group, to determine the outliers. We will have those at the end of the month. And we will begin our outreach process described in our presentation.
And the year 1, 2, and 3, that's in the current order
Yes.
as far as that treatment. Okay.
Well, I think, no, clarification, that is, in our groundwater management plan that is currently under review, I don't believe that the current order doesn't specify what the coalitions must do in years 1, 2, and 3, but it says that we have to have groundwater management plans. In our East San Joaquin groundwater management plans, which are similar to our surface water plans, we would propose the iterative process, as it currently exists through our surface water process. I just want to clarify the distinction there, but I don't believe the current order actually specifies what happens in years 1, 2, or 3.
Let me just add on a little bit to one of the points that Board Member Diadamo raised. That's with respect to the incentive for joining the coalition. I think like her, I am extremely supportive of the coalition's approach. I see the coalition as providing great value and a tremendous asset to the entire irrigated lands program. So I'm a bit disheartened to hear that this issue of public reporting of field level data seems to be or at least what I'm hearing, the primary, if not only incentive for growers to participate in coalition. And that raises a red flag for me. And I'm sure we'll be hearing from many of the speakers later on today, but I wonder how has the coalition, Perry, for example, been communicating your value to the grower community besides the data aspect?
We communicate all the time the value. We continually have meetings where we explain what we are doing for growers. They're very appreciative of it. The concern is the information and the possible abuse of that information. It's a very contentious issue now in the state, and there's a heightened concern of growers of their vulnerability to that data on fertilizer use being made publicly available before we figured out nitrogen removed, before we figured out all this information. We want some time to figure out what are the right numbers, because as we was talked about earlier, we need the MPEP effort. We need to know what's being done, but maybe we're doing things right, maybe we need to correct things, but we believe that it's too premature to be putting data that may be incorrect into the public hands. That's a big concern.
One provision is that there would be a 3-year lag in this draft order, and that's a certain amount of time, but you're saying 3 years is too short a time.
Well, and let me add to that. So, we have, and just a clarification, there's a difference in how the data is reported that comes in on the farm evaluations versus the nitrogen summary reports. The farm evaluation data gets reported to the regional board actually for each field or management unit or whatever. But what it doesn't have is the specific, APN or parcel number. It basically says field 1 in township X, and field 2 in township X. So the location identification is based upon township, but the regional board does get individual data records with respect to the management practices that are being implemented through the farm evaluation. The nitrogen summary report information is, aggregated on the township basis from the field information that the coalition receives. In large part, because this was a huge contention when we were negotiating and getting these orders through the regional board, right? That was a huge give from the agricultural community at the time that we were working on these orders in 2012 and 2013, was trying to protect, in particular, the total applied nitrogen information because of the concerns. We are seeing nuisance lawsuits. We are seeing RCRA lawsuits, or at least in the dairy context. I mean, there is a whole new world out there in exposure and liability on growers, and that is of huge concern. I look at websites of plaintiffs' attorneys firms all the time saying, hey, contact us and we'll help you bring a lawsuit against someone if your well is impacted for exceeding nitrates. We know that a case down in Southern California of dairies has 46 plaintiffs because plaintiffs' law firm sent out private investigators to identify 46 plaintiffs. This is a dairy that's closed. So this world out there is real and it's happening. And so you have to put that backdrop in there when you're talking about the privacy issue and the coalition incentive. And no, it's not the only incentive for people to be in coalitions, but it is a big one. And again, because this was a big part of what we'd looked to negotiate when we were even getting these orders adopted in 2012 and 2013. And I'm sure you're going to hear just the opposite from the next panel as to why it's important for the information to be public, but we're just trying to be open and honest here as to why we think the privacy portion of it is huge on our end. And many growers actually believe that, nitrogen application is a trade secret. I know that there are others that disagree, but there are many growers that do believe it is. And you're also talking economic information. You're talking crop yields. You're talking about people's, what they're growing, what they may be making, right? I mean, you're talking about people's private economic information when you look at it from the fact that people are having to report their crop yields.
Can I follow on that? Because this is one of the questions I had kind of prepared for the workshop, and you actually provide an answer in your recommendations. That is, some sort of middle ground on this difficult topic. That is requiring the periodic audits, or perhaps having this order be more specific in direction with the regional board on, the frequency and quantity and magnitude of that endeavor. Would the folks you represent be comfortable, though, with the public availability of that data that's sunshined through an audit procedure? Would that be, because it seems to me if we're going to have the auditing, that information should be publicly available via GeoTracker in some sense, just for the integrity and transparency of that type of a function, which could be carried out by a third party too. Not necessarily make that a staff requirement, but something that could be contracted with a mutually respected entity like UC Cooperative Extension.
I'm going to give a really good lawyer answer. It depends. And I think it depends with, when you're talking about, the audit information being out there and transparent. Does that mean those lucky growers that get audited, it is their individual information that gets put out there just because by virtue of luck? Or is it the information is public, but there is some way to protect the individual name, location, etc.? I think in the latter, I would be open to having that conversation. If it's, and this individual's audit is public and with their name and their operation for the world to see, that I might have a concern with.
Another question, I think this one's for Perry. You mentioned the 78 management plans that have been completed, and that was approved by the executive officer. Were any of those management plans and the completion process draw any public comment or scrutiny?
Not that I'm aware of. I think we talked about them in regional board meetings as we were progressing with them because of the pesticides that were of focus were high visibility pesticides. But I don't know that, no, we did not get public comments on those management plans. You're talking about the construction of them and the implementation of them.
All of them, all the above. It seems like this is this has been a very successful, but also a critical component of the irrigated lands program, and I'm now looking towards that side of the house. For those who have been critical of this program, I'm wondering, and perhaps they'll talk about it when they come up, why there hasn't been any engagement in these management plans.
I wouldn't know how to answer that. They
Okay.
certainly are aware of them because, as Pamela said, they're in, and Ms. Creedon said, they're in their staff reports, they're in our annual reports, they're listed, they're iterated. We've had them since 2006, I think, was our first two exceedances triggered management plan. So they've been out there for, gosh, what is that now, 7 years?
I think actually, Member Dodek, if you go back and look at CSPA's petition, they might raise issues with them, but CSPA has been the primary entity with respect to the surface water issues from, another side. I don't know that they put in a panel request. I don't know if they're here today or not, but,
Good point.
I would look at the CSPA petition raises some of the surface water issues where they would have concern. We would, of course, disagree with them and think we've proven the successes that we have, but just to give you an FYI.
I have a question for one of the three of you, Perry, Patrick, or Michael. There was some question raised as to how precise these management plans, what is it called, MPEP, how precise they will be, or will we, at the end of putting those together and looking at them very carefully, essentially have something that is works in one farm but doesn't work in another. I mean, it's the same practice, but it's just going to vary from place to place, so that you don't get the value of doing an MPEP is may not be as great as the cost of it, particularly if you go to some other ways of collecting information that would go into making some kind of a judgment about how something could be done.
Well, let me start and ask that the slide on the box and whisker plot, I think is a good illustration of, and I'm going to turn it over to Patrick to fill in, but if you picture the box and whisker plot, we're going to get results back from growers that are going to be in the box, the majority of growers, which I would maintain a lot of them are doing things correctly. So we're going to go in our MPEP and look at those practices that are causing growers to be in a good position and show that they're in the norm, which again, I think many of them are doing the right job, and then turn it over to our partners that are the experts to say, we collect the data and let's look at the data and what that provides. But I think the variability, Patrick's worked on almonds for many years and I think can address that.
So yeah. Okay, now I'm on. Thank you for the opportunity, and they're calling up the box plot right now. I think the reality is one of the great advantages of the A/R methodology, and particularly if it's the integrity of the data is maintained and the grower is confident in sharing that data. The value of it is it gives the individual grower a measure of their own performance. From that, they have the imperative then to say, well, what toolkit do I now have to bring my numbers back into compliance with my peers? The true beauty of that is then the grower has their own context, their own irrigation systems, their own soil systems to make that interpretation, to bring in private information and technological advances from industry, etc., as well as draw upon the toolkit, which is the MPEP. So it'll be a library of here are some possibilities, here are some approaches. Now it's your imperative to take those and do the best that you can. I think one thing that's underestimated in these box whisker plots is certainly there's value in identifying the bad outliers and to make focused efforts with them. But from a research perspective, there's also tremendous value in identifying the good outliers and to parse that data and say, well, what is it about those good producers who allow them a satisfactory A/R while maintaining productivity? And there's no better learning experience, in my experience working with growers, there's no better training and learning practice than bringing an underperforming farmer to a field day on a good performing farmer's practices. That's where education occurs. So I think MPEP is absolutely iterative. It is the toolkit, the library of practices, the beauty of the A/R approach, I believe, at the field scale, if the data has good integrity, which speaks to the issues of privacy and participatory roles, is the ability for it to drive the individual growers' management decisions.
Yeah, it's sort of the Malcolm Gladwell theory, the early adopters pulling along the others. In this work, so, I mean, one of the distinctions and one of the arguments we'll hear as we listen to the speakers is that somehow having this data be more transparent will yield a faster set of individual decisions to really focus on using less. In this current one, where you're bringing in all of the information into the coalition, you share the information, this is the information you share with everyone in your coalition so they can see do they see where they are and where everybody else is?
Township.
Anonymized in the township. So they, in the first year, are seeing where they are compared to their peers within the same township.
Correct, yes.
So under the current system, they're getting all that data to be able to say, well, Joe's growing something similar to me and he's using a fraction of what I am. We may be on different soils or whatnot, but there's a flag. So that happens in the current one.
Not so much Joe. It'll be another almond grower. So, for instance.
So it'll be 6 or 7,
Right,
not Joe.
correct. Yes.
Even within the group, but then you can do a matchmaking so that, or you can just do a field trip to one of the guys who has the lowest numbers and invite lots of people
Yeah,
to
the
go.
plan
I'm trying
is-
to get the mechanics
Yeah, the
of
plan
how,
is it's difficult to go to, say, Joe's doing the best job and say, let's have a field day at your farm. He says, no way people are coming on my farm. We find cooperators and talk about management practices that go to almonds, because that's been the most work, is we're learning what are the good irrigation, fertilizer timing and such. And it doesn't need to be Joe's farm. It can be an iteration of what that grower does. If Joe's willing to have us come on his farm, that's great, but it doesn't always have to be his farm, because we have a pretty good idea how the work has gone with almonds and walnuts too. This is the kind of the suite of practices, the 4R principle type practices that growers are going to need to move toward if they aren't already.
and so then as you talk to your coalition members about how this works, I'm trying to see the
Right.
web of incentives that happen here and the mechanisms through which something really happens. You might have a conversation with all of your almond farmers saying, here's our box plot. 18 and 19, those dots have got to go away within a year. And the rest of this range has got to shrink so we can show the regional board and the public at a more anonymized level that the actions we're taking are reducing the loading without getting that precise nexus or connection to what's actually happening in groundwater that's going to take a lot longer than in surface water. Is that the conversation? So that if you look at, because I think this is a bit of the theory behind transparency after 3 years, is that in theory, this box plot replicated over the course of a number of years is going to get much narrower. And that's how you would show that we've reduced our nitrogen loading, at least at a gross level in a way.
Yeah, I think that's correct. Yes. And I think just to reiterate, to summarize, as far as like the coalition taking this information, so there's a grower 18 and grower 19, right? Those would be the ones we would go and target for individual communications like we did with the surface water program when we knew that we had a pesticide showing up in a watershed, and, grower 18 and grower 19, we know from the pesticide use reports, use that pesticide at about the same time frame when we had the exceedance. So they would be, we see as our coalition role being able to have that follow-up. And you're right. And then if that grower continues, if 18 and 19 shows up in year 2 and year 3, well, then there's a problem with grower 18 and 19, and we need to think about how do we then deal and maybe consult with the regional board in dealing with grower number 18 and 19 individually without exposing, all 4,000 growers to public information. I mean, obviously a big component of this is the regional board still has its enforcement authority. And I would say that if you're grower 18 and 19 and in year 3 you're still the outlier, then you're in violation of the waste discharge requirements because you're clearly not implementing good management practices, or you're not best practical treatment or control. So I would imagine that there is enforcement action that could be taken on those folks unless they have, it was, a good reason, agronomic reason as to why they were this outlier that year or over time. But absolutely, those would be the ones that that could then be subject to some type of enforcement action.
One thing I want to add too, you made a statement about outreach to all the growers. Don't underestimate what already has occurred and the amount of awareness since that template went out to, I'll speak for our coalition, the awareness has gone up magnitudes on nitrogen management. So we're going to be building on that. They know this is coming. So it started already. It's not something that we're waiting for, whatever the outcome of this is. It started and we're moving in that direction.
So we should be able to see, even without the theoretical added acceleration of that movement, if you saw 3 years of this, you would see dramatic reductions in.
Well, again, do we need reductions? That's what we need to verify with MPEP. There's a lot of advances have been made in the last 5 to 10 years. Tremendous. We may be in some crops in great shape, but yes,
I get that.
Yes.
Yeah,
Theory.
that's fair. Can I ask one other question? I know we're getting late and I'm running into everybody's blood sugar levels, and I apologize for that, let alone the poor court reporter who's been, thank you. Great. The drinking water wells. I know this is a bigger question. I recognize what it is you're saying, and I think it highlights just the enormity of that challenge. And this may be a perilous question to ask. And one of the things that has surprised me, perhaps, is that you could have so many people with drinking water wells on their property and they're not already testing them anyway. I don't totally get that, just as I don't totally get how in our Gamma program we can offer to test people's wells for free and they won't let us. They don't want to know. That's a much bigger question. But again, we are dealing with this issue of people drinking contaminated water, and I do think figuring out how to remedy it, and as you know, we've been working on every belt suspenders flying monkey tool we can get because it is such an important issue. But it is still striking to me that there are so many that aren't already being tested. I'm just saying.
Yeah, and I don't know the answer to that. I do know from our Central Coast experience, frankly, with the Central Coast Groundwater Coalition, the domestic well testing was required, but many of them had already done it, and many of them had already provided bottled water or put in treatment units in their, in any type of tenant rental unit, or if it was a domestic well that supplied a shop, right? They had water bottles that said, "Don't drink the water." I mean, I think most of them had already dealt with the situation, and I don't know, if there's a parallel in the valley. I honestly don't have any idea, and I don't know, and that's, and beyond the irrigated lands program, I don't know how many people, the person in the subdivision who has a domestic well, how often do they test their well, or do they ever?
And I just add, for the Central Coast, the other organization I work for, Cures, had a grant to provide free bottled water, and one of the barriers for several applicants is we were required with the grant to post their information on GeoTracker, and they said, "No way am I going to put my information on a public website." End of story. And that's anecdotal. That was just a handful, but it's a concern. And this wasn't just farmers either.
All right, go ahead.
Be quick.
No, that's okay. I mean, that's the whole point of the day, is to illuminate, so I don't want to.
So the superstars on this box and Worcester's plot, can you talk a little bit about pending the development of, and I always forget the name of it, but the management practices effectiveness, right? In the interim, aren't you using information on the superstars, or at least some information that you're getting from that, on your annual meeting? And then also, I think you have a quarterly newsletter, as I recall, and the annual report to get information out. So we may not know if it's Joe or if it's farmer number 19, in the township, but you are putting that information out in the meantime. And question number one. And number two, don't you have speakers at these events where
Right.
growers are
Yeah, to
also
answer the
hearing
first
not just from
question-
you, but from others, researchers, et cetera?
So to answer the first question, we have really good guidance information from CDFA on about a dozen crops. So we've got some baseline that we're going to be using as the basis of these, the guys in the red there are doing a pretty good job. Excuse me. And then as far as our annual or our member meetings and such, yes, we have a CCA that comes and talks about the 4 Rs, proper nitrogen management. Yes, so we're charging ahead to get that out. There's also a CDFA-funded project that is working on grower certification, so they don't need a CCA. We've had already 1,000 growers go through that in 6 months' time. So there's a lot of interest and knowledge being gained right now because of this issue and because of what the Irrigated Lands Program has done. So
Right.
it is moving forward.
And then the last is a request, just because I'm going to anticipate what the next panel is, one of the issues that they may raise, and that is that the education is not robust enough. And I do have questions about an online participation in the annual event, the class. And maybe we talked about this as well, maybe a requirement for in-person for outliers. I suspect a lot of people are going to want to continue to go because that's where a lot of dialogue, just like going to a conference versus viewing it on the web. But the request that I have of you is to consider some type of testing, especially for outliers. And then also some type of interaction with the EJ community and those that are concerned that your program is not robust enough. I always hear how wonderful and informative these events are, but if there are questions, I think it'd be helpful to share some information with those that have been raising those questions, just to be open to suggestions as to how to improve your program.
Yeah, and we have quarterly stakeholder meetings Sue McConnell puts on where we solicit that sort of comment. So yeah, that'd be a good venue, I think, for all the coalitions to hear that.
And we provide free lunch.
Yeah, no, they have to pay $10.
All right. Then
Almost free.
thank you all for your patience. This is very helpful.